U.S. President Joe Biden has met with leaders from several African states for a summit in Washington that's focused, we're told, on strengthening the continent's position in geopolitics. International Relations Minister Dr. Naledi Pandor led the South African delegation in place of President Cyril Ramaphosa. Now get this, Washington has pledged 850 billion rand to help improve health, security and economic challenges that are plaguing the continent. The U.S. also believes that China and Russia are investing billions of dollars in Africa in order to destabilize the continent, but China says the U.S. has no place in attacking other countries in order to gain an advantage in Africa. Let's unpack these developments for you now. Bringing our guest, Dr. Jason Musyoka is CEO of the Frontline Group, joining us via our video link this morning. Doc, it's great to see you. Thanks so much indeed for speaking to us on the Weekend Report. Interesting to track the back and forth between these powerhouses, the US, China and Russia. Are we seeing signs of some kind of second scramble for Africa?
Yes, Ayanda, thank you so much for having me. And I think we have seen, particularly since the beginning of the current century now, there has been emerging new geopolitics playing out, and it was pretty much unexpected as far as the U.S. was concerned, that China, by the turn of the second decade of the century, that China would really be competing with the U.S. on a global platform. So that much was not that clear. And so from around the 2010s, you begin to see the U.S. beginning to counter the influence of Africa, of China in Africa and around the world, and pushing back. And this clearly has a relationship with these kinds of geopolitics. They relate to the fact that the 2014 African Union-US Summit was set up. And keep in mind that the AU-US Summit in 2014 came on the back of years of China-African Summit, the African-China Forum, that has been held 3 years since the year 2000. So it's more of really a pushback, and you're seeing the U.S. beginning to assert its influence in the continent, particularly recognizing two key problems here, Ayanda. The one is that China is an emerging power, and it needs to be contained to some extent. They even have a China containment policy in the U.S., for example. And the second big problem is the fact that Africa is also an emerging geopolitical player, although on a much smaller scale. So with those two problems, the U.S. somehow has to find a way of expanding or asserting its influence in the continent and looking for ways in which China could be contained from the current emergence.
Given that context and potentially the U.S.'s intention, what should we read into this pledge that's been made by Washington? These billions of rand, if you, of course, do the conversions in an effort to help the region and deal with several of its challenges. It doesn't sound completely altruistic. There are obviously some political intentions here.
Oh, clearly. And I think that the U.S., to be fair, has been a major critical player as far as the health sector in the continent is concerned. In fact, the U.S. largest expenditure on aid in the continent has really been on the health sector. And both the private sector and multilateral agreements between U.S. and Africa has largely been focused on health. So that much is clear. USAID is a major funder, by the way, on health and digitalization of health and those kinds of initiatives. But there is also the idea of food security, and you've seen those kinds of programs also with the U.S. implementing. Now, I think that with what Joe Biden has been trying to do is, of course, to advance the momentum of what has been going on over the last couple of years. So it's expected that you're going to see expansion of the health programs. However, that being said, there's a lot written about the impact of the kind of relationship that U.S. and Africa has, and that it's failed to deliver tangible results. In fact, some of the key criticisms are that the relationships have largely benefited the political class and not the ordinary African citizen. Mm-hmm. So China's pushback is very different. I think in 2009, you've seen China succeed or overtake the U.S. as the largest trading partner. So again, the issue for U.S. even now in the current summit that has just ended is the idea of what the U.S. can do for the continent. And one very interesting thing, Ayanda, is that there was a recognition of Africa's emergence as a geopolitical player. And again, this is directly linked to the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the fact that Africa has been very consequential in abstaining from voting for sanctions that have been advanced by the EU and the US. So all this to suggest that the relationship between the US and Africa seems to be still the traditional classic model of aid, and we want to support and we want to help. So Africa is still there's asymmetrical relationship,
right?
And Africa is not a global player as opposed to what China seems to be doing.
Very interesting that. We also know that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And I wonder to what extent we should be concerned of Africa being used as this battleground for a proxy economic war between China and the US. I mean, depending on how, for instance, some of these agreements, if any, do emerge from a summit like this actually pan out, Africa could find itself on the back foot because of essentially what's taking place between these two superpowers, as I mentioned, with Africa just being the battleground for that.
That's one way of looking at it, and it's a possibility, but I think there is more possibility in the opportunity that Africa has with the current scramble for influence in the continent. Because if these kinds of influences or contests between the geopolitics of China and the US, if they are the opportunities are harnessed by African leaders, I think we are likely to see benefits cascade to your ordinary citizens. So I see this as an opportunity. I think China has clearly demonstrated that there could be partnerships that are modeled slightly differently and that benefit the continent. A survey was done recently, by the way, and 76% of between 18 and 24-year-olds in the continent are very positive about the relationship between China and the continent. And they claim that they have seen more benefits than losses. And here you're talking of consumer goods, cell phones, and digitalization and the infrastructure and so on. So I think this is an opportunity, but I also think that it's not going to naturally materialize to benefits for the African citizens. I think that the leaders, politicians, and the multilateral players, they need to find much more strategic ways of harnessing the opportunity from not just the U.S. and China, by the way, but we've seen also China-Japan summit, Japan-African summit. We've also seen European Union-African summit. It's a range of players who I think we need to find some much more strategic ways of harnessing the kind of scramble that is going on.
Interesting that you mentioned African leaders. We're dealing with the ANC's leadership battle here in South Africa, and that also feeds into these kind of conferences, of course, summits, because we know whoever emerges as the leader of the governing party typically makes it to the president's chair. But we also showed you a picture there, which was tweeted by the executive director of UNAIDS, that's Winnie Byanyima, who essentially pointed out that there's something seriously wrong around the kind of leaders we have on the continent. Let's bring that picture up so that, visually you're able to see that yourself. In all of the people who are present, I'm only able to spot one woman in that picture. That's something we should be concerned about, surely.
Indeed, and I think there is also a lot of assessment on the failures of the African Union, African states in particular, and one of the key areas that the continent has not succeeded very well, or has not succeeded, has really been an issue of gender. I think that much is very clear. But there's also a criticism around the fact that there is not a uniform agenda for the continent. Yes, we do have the AFCFTA, we have Agenda 2063, and part of Agenda 2063 looks at issues of gender, it looks at issues of custom unions, and currencies and trade and all of that. But the progress towards those objectives has been very slow. Rwanda has been reasonably successful as far as gender issues are concerned, but that's 1 out of 54 countries. And so I think that is an issue. And even then, you're looking at political participation more than real gender-based development. And I think those are key challenges that the continent is facing. And the second one, by the way, there is a lot of theory around, particularly in political science, that suggests that the more you have women leaders, the more you're likely to be effective, especially around issues of security. And I think that maybe that's a theory that could be tested, and to find out if we have change of guards, particularly around gender issues, whether we would arrive at a much better stable continent than we currently are in.
Dr. Jason Musyoka, it's great to get your insights on the summit. Thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Dr. Musyoka is the CEO of the Frontline Group. Once again, thanks very much indeed. In other news this morning,